Welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. Whether you're a first-time facilitator or a seasoned pro, listen in for tips and tricks to make a bigger impact at the next workshop you deliver. And now, your host. Her favourite actress is Margot Robbie, Leanne Hughes.
G'day and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Leanne Hughes, and I'm here to help you create unpredictable workshop experiences that predictably work. Guys, time of recording or release is the 3rd of August, so you've got a couple of days if you're keen to get enrolled into the Virtually Possible program. Now, this is a program that Yuri Schilders and I are putting together. Yuri was a guest on episode 126 of the show. We're teaming up. We reckon it's virtually possible to recreate the energy of a face-to-face workshop. We think it's possible. You can move that online, and we're excited to share with the community on how to do that. You can use the code PODCAST, that's podcast, to get 15% off, and a link to that is in the show notes. Really keen, visit firsttimefacilitator.com/VP apply. That's /VP apply. Panels. I'm not talking about the panels on your house. I'm talking about those panel discussions that sometimes, because we have facilitation skills, we're asked to facilitate, we're asked to lead. Now, with these panel discussions, I don't know about you, but I've seen some really great ones. I've also seen some ordinary ones, and I've probably been a part and a contributor to both of those. A few years ago, maybe it was a bit longer than that actually, probably 5 years ago, it's a time where I was really into a TV show called Q&A. It's on the ABC, which is an Australian channel. The host of that, the moderator, was Tony Jones. He's now moved on, he's retired. But it's basically a show where they talk about current affairs, but they get really diverse panelists on the show. The audience asks questions and it's all live. Now, it's interesting. Some people didn't like Tony as a host, but I really loved his style. It was direct. It was funny. He was really good at keeping people on track, slowing them down, segueing the conversation, moving it along, getting panelists to argue, add, retract. Had a lot of great drama, but also a bit of comedy. I thought Tony brought that in. So I love that dynamic style. I think the ones that are ordinary are the panelists where they'll ask panelist A a question, they'll ask panelist B the same question, and ask panelist C the same question, then they'll move to the next question. I think that's pretty ordinary. And it's really funny, over 131 episodes of this show, and today we explore a topic that we've never discussed before, but it sounds obvious to explore, and that is moderation, panel moderation. That's what we talk about with today's guest, Kjell Lutz. He's got a lot of great tips, practical advice on things that you can do if you're moderating a panel. I love moderating. One of my favorite gigs moderating was for my old company, up on stage with our executive team. Questions were coming through on Slido. I loved balancing up the questions, getting the audience involved. And I guess this conversation with Kjell reminded me of something that I love, and maybe I should consider doing more of it because I really enjoyed the good old panel. So who is Kjell Lutz? Well, he's Dutch and he's fascinated by how people learn. During his studies in organisational psychology, he immersed himself in the theory of knowledge transfer and how can you help people learn. He first applied this with small groups during training, then online with e-learning, and then with large groups during meetings. And now he's fully immersed himself in the psychology of making choices. Kjell loves to lead different work forms that contribute to the learning process of the participants. Let people experience something meaningful in a playful way. And he gives a really great example of how he gets that experiential learning out in this episode. As a speaker, Kjell ensures that the dialogue session is properly initiated with an appropriate keynote. And you'll hear how he influences his clients in this interview as well. As a moderator, Kjell facilitates the rounds of conversations to create the space that is needed. So in this episode, you'll hear how Kjell got his start with moderating panels and MCing, how he creates that dynamic conversation I spoke about, that Tony Jones-esque type of conversation, and how he gets large audiences interacting with content as well. If you'd love to reach out to Kjell, connect with him on LinkedIn. That's how we met. And you can find all of his details, website, etc. over in the show notes for this one at firsttimefacilitator.com/episode 132. Of course, if you want to continue the conversation when the podcast is over, join our community of over 940 facilitators on the free Facebook group called The Flip Chart. And remember that 15% discount if you'd love to sign up for the first Virtually Possible program. We cannot wait for it to kick off. We have some absolute guns in this community. Well, they're all guns. Head on over to firsttimefacilitator.com/VP apply. Now, on to the show. I'm delighted to welcome onto the First Time Facilitator podcast, Kjell Lutz. Kjell, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I was looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. It's been a long time coming. And actually, it's quite funny. I was reading through LinkedIn, like the initial context of our conversation was going to be around, let's talk about facilitating hundreds of people in the same room, like big events. And now we're going to switch the conversation to something a little bit different. But I think a lot of that sort of philosophy applies to virtual. But first of all, can you share with our listeners and myself, I mean, this is the first time we've spoken. Tell us your story and how you discovered the world of hosting, facilitation, training, speaking.
Yeah. Shall I do the short version? If you want to elaborate somewhere, just let me know and I'll do that. I studied psychology, so I always thought I would train people in communication skills or conflict resolution, those kinds of things. But when I ended up on the job market, there was a crisis, so I ended up doing e-learnings. So I was a project manager there, and I noticed I wanted to be in front of people, so I ended up taking a trainer job, but it was training software. So the use of software skills and range of products. But we also had these customer days. So I need to do a presentation once a year for a large group, a couple of hundred people. And the first year I just did a presentation. It was fine. People really liked it. And the next year I had to make a couple of presentations. And the years afterwards, I did all the presentations. I made all the presentations. Wow. And I coached the people doing the presentations. And then one year we were going to the cloud, which back then was a big thing. We had a huge venue, it was all new, it was special. We're going to in the cloud. And during my presentation, everything went black. All the software, everything blacked out. So I needed to keep talking to keep people busy. So the moderator we hired afterwards said, yeah, you did kind of a good job. Isn't moderating something for you? I thought, well, maybe it is. And next year I did it. And from then onwards, we have a couple of those customer days for different products. We had an event division as well who did a lot of events. And then each time goes, yeah, we can hire someone. Yeah, that costs a lot of money. Kjell did a nice job. Kjell, could you? And then, I started doing more and more. So that's how it started.
Oh my gosh, we have the exact same career history. I was just taking quick notes as you were saying things. So my first job out of university, after I went backpacking around Europe, was working for Accenture in e-learning, instructional design.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And same as you, I got into, and then I started like training a few people. And over the course of my career, it was like just the opportunity started stacking up and you do one gig, people recognize you, get called back. Particularly working internally, everyone's like, well, they're a cheaper option because they already work here. And we love it because we're like, we get to do the fun stuff. Yeah. How funny. I love that. Yeah, the internal opportunities is a really big thing. So I guess if anyone's listening, take encouragement from that. Find the opportunities working internally. So let's talk about moderating. Because look, I think it's like 130 episodes of the First Time Facilitator podcast, and we haven't really talked about moderating. So can you share, I guess, what you discovered when you went from training and presentations to moderation to panels and things like that? How did you find doing that? And what are some key skills in moderating panels and events?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap, a lot of the same skills you need. But when you're facilitating, you want to reach a certain goal, and you're the one that's working hard or a bit less hard to achieve that goal. And when you're moderating, there's usually someone in between. There's a panel or there's a speaker you want to deliver something. So it takes a bit of more setup to work with the room. You also have a lot more people, so there's less personal connection. You need to use the group a lot more, but there's a lot of overlap. But for instance, if I would give a training, I would talk to all the 20 people I have or 12 people up front and ask what they want, what they want to do. With 100 people, that's not possible. But you might say, are you interested in it? Please raise your hand if you do, or stand up or something like that. So you use different techniques, but a lot of the same skills.
And how do you find it when you get, it's like 100 people? Like you said, even in groups of 20 people, some people are just scared to talk and interact. So how do you create an environment where people feel safe enough to put their hand up or stand up? Do you do anything to make them feel safe?
Have you ever heard of the foot in the door technique?
Yeah, I mean, Psych 101. I did Psych as well. Like we're exactly the same person.
Can you explain it or should I?
We could tag team this. So foot in the door is if you're going for an ask, you ask for something small before you ask for something big to get that commitment, essentially. Yeah,
and the chances of people doing it are much, much larger. So if you have a group, for instance, if you want them to dance, you don't start the day with people dancing. Nobody will do that. It's just too big an ask. But the first thing you can do is ask them to raise their hand. That's safe. It shouldn't be an awkward question about their very personal thing. But for example, what I do a lot is just checking who's there. So I'll know that there are nurses, doctors, and teachers in the room. So I'll ask, who are nurses here? And a lot of people will raise their hand. Who are teachers that will raise their hand? Who are doctors? And because people complied with what you do, the next thing you will ask, they're more likely to do it. So the next thing you can do is ask them to stand up. And you can go a bit further each step. And then you can ask, does anyone want to ask something? And because you made it safe the first couple of times, everybody responded, it is safe, they will do it the next time as well. So you have to have a build-up with large groups. Well, small groups as well, I believe, but especially in large groups, it's important that everybody sees it's safe, it's okay to share, to participate.
Yeah, definitely. I call it reducing the friction, like a low friction question to get people in. And in psych, actually, I love that. So the foot in the door is awesome. There was also another technique, I think it was called door in the face. Did you ever learn door in the face?
No, I didn't. What's door in the face?
Yeah. So that's when you ask for something really big. You actually want something like, say you wanted someone to sponsor you like $100. You ask for 100,000. They'll be like, no. And they're like, well, can you give me 100? And they're like, oh, okay. So you're sort of going the other way around, but that probably wouldn't work in facilitation. I don't know.
Yeah. Did you ever use that in facilitation or?
No, I haven't. I've always gone foot in the door, but I'm wondering, should I just get everyone at the beginning and go, right, I want you to dance. And if they don't, I'll go, okay, well, can you just stand up and talk to the person next to you? That seems a little bit easier.
Yeah,
maybe we could do it. Reverse it.
Yeah. Never thought about that.
No. So how are you going? Are you moving your workshops online? Are you still doing this moderation thing in a virtual setting now because of COVID? Have you had much experience there?
Yeah, well, started last week. You can host events here again. So I had my first two events last week, finally. Yeah. A lot of distance, 1.5 meters in between. So I had a room for 600 people filled with 100 people. So that's a really weird feeling. But most events have gone online, of course. So that's why you see the green screen behind me. I have this whole studio set up at home because most is online right now, of course.
Yeah. How did that feel? Because this is actually really cool. We get to document this whole sort of COVID process, people going into lockdown and now re-emerging out of it. How was that as a facilitator when you got everyone sort of spaced out? Did it feel a bit weird? Were people a little bit anxious around each other?
I don't think people feel anxious. It was really weird for me because from a business perspective, it felt like starting over again. Because when you first start your business, you do a lot of freebies, you need to practice, you need to do get your experience on. And it was the same online. So I did a lot of free events just to get experience, to learn how to use Zoom and all the other stuff. So it felt like starting a new business again before getting paid for jobs again. But people in Zoom, I think, are a lot more open than in rooms because it's a safe environment. Everybody's at home. People are more personal as well. It's easier to be more personal when you're in your own environment or the cat jumps on the table. That's fine. Or if the speaker doesn't have makeup on. If that would happen on stage, everybody would be, that's weird. What's going on? And at home, that's fine. We're okay. So it made it more personal.
Actually, it's funny you say that because I'm wearing this denim jacket for our interview and I'm like, I probably wouldn't wear this if we were like meeting up in person for a face-to-face. You're right. It does make it a bit more
I would
personal.
be suited up, of course.
Okay. That's good. So let's talk about panel moderation. You've got, say, 3 panelists. You're the moderator. How do you ensure that you get the best out of each speaker? And it's not like okay, you answer this and then you answer this. How do you create some sort of cool interaction with panel interviews?
Yeah, the most important thing is who's in the panel. Because usually someone who hires you will have thought about the people who need to go into the panel. And it might be the sponsors, or it might be the people who didn't get a place in the regular program. So it's usually the waste bin of the conference, to be honest. It's that place to be in.
Yeah.
And that makes it really difficult because what you want is you want 3 different viewpoints. So, for example, you want one scientific expert about the subject, one a lawmaker, and a person with personal experience, because then you can look at 3 different viewpoints. So the most important thing as a moderator is getting the right people in the panel. And that's also the hardest part.
Oh, so how do you do that? I mean, how do you influence clients if they've gone like, these are the 3 sponsors we're going to get and they all are scientists? Like, how do you influence back to them and use your expertise to influence that?
Yeah, basically what we just said, we'll talk it over with the client. I'll use less harsh words. We'll talk about it slowly, but it's all about what do you want to achieve with the panel. If the only thing they want to achieve is to give the sponsors time, then this is probably the best setup. You just won't have a good conversation. If the goal is to get a good conversation, then you can say, okay, if we want good conversation, then what we need is different viewpoints. Can we make that happen? So it takes a bit of time, a bit of greasing it over, getting people to see what's needed for achieving the goal. But the important thing is, what is the goal? Then what do we need to do?
Yeah, that's really important because I guess as moderators, we always assume the goal is to have a great conversation. Like that's why we're there. That's what drives us. But we've got to realize that also, well, actually, no, it's to give some airtime and to build someone up or whatever that is. So when you're on these panel interviews, how do you deal with if someone is just got the microphone and they are taking up most of the airtime? Like, how do you share that load with others?
Yeah, I'm going to go back a bit to your earlier question about how do you get them to interact? Because what you don't want is I'll ask a question, then I'll ask the question to the next panelist. That's the worst thing you can do. So in a good conversation, you want them to talk with each other. So it's very important to question to the first person and then let the next person respond to what the first person said. And the most easy way to do that is to look at nonverbal signs. So the first person, maybe the scientist, will have said something, and you can see the lawmaker nodding his head. So you can say, I saw you were nodding. Do you agree? And then he will continue the conversation. And then, for example, the person with the personal experience will say, will be shaking his head. No, I don't agree. You can say, you don't agree. What's your viewpoint? And then you continue the conversation. And after you've done that a couple of times, they will just keep on continuing the conversation without you having to step in as much.
I love that. It's like lazy moderation. It's brilliant. It makes you look great as well because then there's a great conversation. And I guess I'd be more curious. I'd definitely want to go to the person. If someone was talking and someone else was like shaking their head, I'd be like, we've got to move to that person. I want to hear.
Absolutely. Yeah, so that's the most important part. After you've done that, you can give your attention to the crowd, the people who are there, see if they are agreeing, if there's a question there. But you need to start up the conversation first. And then you can run into problems like what you said, someone's hogging the mic. You need to interrupt them. It's simple as that.
Do you have any key phrases that you use to do that?
No, because I always try to do it based on content. So he will say something, and usually if someone is talking for a very long time, he will add to it. But the basic premise has already been made, or the key phrase has already been said. So you just repeat the phrase. So if I understand it correctly, you said blah, 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 and then you just ask someone else to respond. You just take it over. And it doesn't feel like being rude because you're asking for clarification, which is fine because it shows interest. And then you ask someone else to respond, which is fine as well.
Oh, that is so ninja. That is a really cool. If I understand it, it is. I think you're like, no, I don't have any key phrases, but I think that's really key, that if I understand it, and that sort of paraphrasing back, but really, really clever. I love it.
If you just interrupt him and you give, can someone else respond? That is just rude. So you need to give him the attention first and then move on. And this is just one phrase. You can do it in all different ways, but you need to value the person for his input because you want him to talk, just not as much.
Yeah, it's not as much. Yeah, I love that. Do you use any interactive tools like Slido or technology, like getting people to ask questions? Do you have any favorites that you want to share with listeners that have worked well for you?
Yeah, I use Slido a lot, especially now, last week, for example, because it's kind of hard. I can't go into the room with a mic anymore. I used to walk all over the room through the people with the mic, or even use Catchbox for certain settings.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's okay. Please explain it to listeners. It's the coolest thing. I love it.
Yeah, a Catchbox is a cube with a microphone in it, but it's soft on all sides. So you can throw it, people can catch it, and they can talk into it. And once they're done, you can throw it back. So if you have a theater set up, it's great for using there because you can't go into the room, or you can even play games with it where you say, throw it around, and the third person catching it has to answer the question, for example. But you can't right now because multiple people will touch it. That's not okay right now. I can't move into the room because I can't go past people in certain settings. So now you want interactive tools to ask questions, for example. And the nice thing about Slido is you can't just ask questions, you can rate the questions. So if you like a question, you like it, it'll appear bigger in I usually have an iPad with me, so I can see all the questions. It'll appear higher, the most asked question, the most liked question, and I can just ask it from the speaker.
It's good that you bring up the iPad. It's probably one of the most, I've got the iPad right in front of me, just even talking to you. I love it. And I've taken it on stages. I've used it to introduce people. I've used it to interact. I think if we were to recommend a tool, iPad definitely, and Catchbox. I do. I love it. I got it in my old company. I was going to buy one when I went out on my own, but I haven't done that yet and obviously don't need to. I've been certainly in some awkward situations where I've thrown it, nearly hit some glasses on a table, and I nearly hit one of our executives once in the head. It was a bit awkward, but
it helps.
Yeah, and it creates a bit of laughter though. Everyone's like, oh, and then it just increases that energy. So it's quite fun. People are quite scared in catching it, like they haven't thrown a ball since they were kids. But
especially if it's the first time they've used it, then what's going to happen? This is scary, but 2 throws and they're in it and it's fine.
Yeah, it's like a beach ball going around. So we got a sport in Australia called cricket and everyone just throws a beach ball around. It's kind of like the same thing with the microphone. Now, the other thing that you do, Kjell, you're a speaker, but you also really focus on interactive speeches and help others do the same thing. Are you noticing a shift towards, like, because usually a traditional keynote is someone will get up and talk for 45 minutes, with slides and it's just their own speech. What are people doing now to create some more interactivity in their keynotes? Do you think more people are joining us in wanting to create more interactive experiences?
Well, in my personal experience, there are 2 groups of speakers. You have the professional speakers who usually do a good job of it, but there's a large group of speakers who are expert about a subject. They might have written a book, they might be the head of something at a company, and they are very knowledgeable about the subject, but not about interaction. So if you ask them, so will there be any interaction? Yes, I'll ask a couple of questions, and that's about it. And I don't think that's changed the last couple of years, in my experience anyway. So you need to help those people get the interaction going.
Yeah, I agree. I've noticed that as well. And I think it's also a case of like pushing someone out of the comfort zone and hopefully giving them some simple tools just to make it more interesting. How long have you been in business, Kjell? How long have you done your own thing?
Yeah, in August, it's my 3rd year for myself.
Oh, congrats.
Thanks.
So in terms of your preparation before moderating workshops, how do you personally prepare for this? Let's say, I always like going the night before, morning of a workshop, something it's a big event, you're nervous. What do you do to prepare?
Yeah, my preparation starts earlier because I need to speak with all the speakers. I want to have spoken with everybody who gets on stage because I need to know what's their goal, what do they want to achieve. I want to check my introduction with them because you can list all the things they've done, but nobody's really interested in that. So my go-to question is always, why are you the one telling this? And then you usually get a short sentence, 1 or 2 sentences that really help explain why a person is there. They might be an expert because of this, they might have 30 years experience, but you get a lot more personal answers to why someone is here, which is good for my introduction. And we'll talk with the person about their goals and how we can achieve them. And if you've talked with someone about their goals, you can suggest interactive things to do to help achieve those goals. So that's a couple of weeks in front. Some speakers you can talk to 3 weeks before. Some speakers need to fix their story a couple of days before. So that's all based on the speakers.
And do you call them or email? Like, is that a preferred, do you call them or face-to-face? How do you do that?
No, I'll email them to make a phone call usually. Or now we use Zoom, of course, as well. Like 15 minutes, 30 minutes call at most. So it doesn't take a lot of time, but it's quite essential for me to get the information. And if they're open for interaction, then it's usually, I haven't thought about that. Can I let it go through my head and we'll make a new appointment? Yeah, that's fine. And I'll make a couple of suggestions about what we could do. And then we usually end up doing so.
I love that. Thank you for sharing your process beforehand. I think that's critical. And I think it's nice to build up rapport with the speakers when they see you on stage or wherever it is. They feel comfortable as well. So that's really important.
Yeah, I need to know who's on there because if there's a question coming from the room, can you ask it directly or do we need to wait to the end of the story? Some speakers will really fumble if they get a question halfway their story. I do think it's better if you can ask at any point in their story, but if they're not equipped to do it, then they shouldn't let it happen, of course.
Yeah. Just before we recorded, I asked you, hey, how do you pronounce your name? How important is that? Is that a question that you ask your speakers as well?
Yeah, definitely. I work a lot in the Netherlands because I'm Dutch, so then it's easy. But I do international conferences as well, so then I need to check a lot because, you want to have it right, of course.
Yeah, definitely.
I write it down phonetically, so just pronunciation. So on my cards, it will be spelled wrong, but pronounced right.
You get it. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
Now, the morning of a big event, what are you doing? Are you going for a run? Are you meditating? Or are you just sleeping in and rocking up? How do you prepare?
Well, it's usually not sleeping in because conferences usually start at, 9, 10. And I need to drive somewhere to go there. I want to be there at least an hour beforehand and usually even more. Because a lot of time when I come there, the setup isn't right or the stage is wrong. They'll have a panel and they've put up tables. You don't want tables between the speakers and the public. So I'll need to change the room or I've had times where the presentations weren't right. And a minute before we had to go live, we were still downloading the last version of the presentation. So I'm always there very early to make sure everything is right. And usually I'm just doing nothing, but that's fine. So no running before, just getting out of bed, getting ready and going there as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I guess my goal is I'd love to be, 30 minutes before just sitting down there having a cup of coffee, scrolling social media, because that means that everything is bright and in place.
Definitely.
Have you been in situations where things just, you mentioned that a presentation you're at where all the tech was failing and you just had to improvise. How did you do that? Like, what did you actually do in that moment?
Well, this was before I was a professional moderator, of course.
Yeah.
But I was telling a story. I don't even remember what it was about. But if you can't go on with your presentation, there's a huge audience you can use. So I started asking questions about it. What do you want to know? What can we do? So it's all about interaction at that time.
So you threw it back to the audience to participate. That's great.
Definitely.
Really cool strategy. I guess, that's probably our worst nightmare, is when things aren't going right and feel like we've got to take ownership and share something. But I feel like if you just put it back in the audience's hands through some clever questions, that sucks up a lot of time as well while you can get other things ready. And it's a good strategy. It's like, again, less pressure on yourself to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Otherwise, to make up an entire story, but why should you? You are there with a lot of people, co-create something in the spot. It's always better.
So good. Do you do like a lot of, I know you do a lot of moderation speaking. Do you do a lot of facilitation and training these days? I know that was like your past in software training. Do you do training now?
Not really. Sometimes I do about moderation skills, online or offline. So last year we went to Prague, for example, and teach people on how to moderate. So that was nice. And I've got a couple of sessions upcoming about how to moderate online and how to design online. Because the biggest change you need to make from offline to online is how do you design the sessions? You can't just do the same thing. It doesn't work. You need to adjust to the program you use, but also how people are online.
Yeah. So have you got one or two things that you could share with listeners on sort of tips if they're simply putting a camera on their face-to-face workshop when they move it? What do they need to really consider before moving their training online?
Well, we already talked a bit about this on LinkedIn, so for a few people it might be double. But if you had a normal workshop, you would welcome everyone. You would talk to them beforehand, so you get to know them. And this is very important if you have a small group. Someone said, I have a problem with that. And what I once did, I was taking over a network session, and they had a problem that most people, or a couple of people, had their camera off and weren't participating. So what I suggested was do a waiting room up front and let people enter one by one. And if they enter, you say their name, you welcome them, usually ask them to change their screen name to their first name and a company name, for example, so you know where they're from. And by doing that, you also ask them to put on the camera. You feel personally connected. If you ask 100 people to do something, not 100 people will do it. But if I come up to you and ask you to do something, there's a very small chance you won't do it. And online, it's the same. So by letting people in one by one, ask them, please put on your camera, nice to see you, make that connection, they are much more likely to participate. Yeah,
because I've certainly been in environments where we had a lot of people entering, and if you start at say 4:00, you've got people entering on 4:00 on the dot or a little bit past, so you're just clicking admit. So it's probably no, exactly. And then you're like, who just joined? And then a few times I've had people join calls and I'm like, who is this person? Like they've had their husband's name on the screen, and I'm like really worried. I'm like, are they going to Zoom bomb this? Like, so. Yeah, it's really important to do that. That's such a cool strategy. Do you have any sort of favorite icebreakers or energizers for either virtual moderation, or do you use icebreakers or energizers when you do panels?
No, as in the sense, I don't think you should do an icebreaker just to do an icebreaker. If you do something, it should also always be part of the content. It should be useful. I don't like people just waving their hands or shaking something. You want to design something that makes sense for the context. But before or say something live, I think it is important online for a Zoom session, for example, that you connect the people. In a previous podcast, someone said, I don't remember who, that there's a difference between communities and a tribe. Communities are open for everyone, and a tribe is closed off. Do you remember that? And
Alan Weiss. Yeah,
important for a Zoom session that you create a tribe, because you want everybody to feel connected. And if they weren't there, they would have missed something. Make people connected can be very simple. For example, I once asked about a session about Corona for what do you miss the most? And because everybody shared something personal, you get to know everybody, they shared something, and you feel more connected right away. And that's important online, that you get that connection, especially with small groups, of course. With 100 people, that's not doable. But if you have a small group, 12, 20 people, that's perfectly fine. And to make it even better, I didn't ask all the people. I just asked a person to say it. And then in Zoom, name the person to their right, which in Zoom is different for everyone. and let them say it. So everybody had to pay attention because you never know when you were coming up. A bit of confusion because, oh no, their turn already, so I need to move over to the next one on the right. But it's very fun and you feel connected right away.
Yeah, I was a part of Jacinta Q, but she was a previous guest. She runs facilitography workshops and she did the same thing. I love it. It's like just you introduce one person and then get them to choose someone else. Again, it's like removing yourself and getting that tribe feel. I actually love that you've made that distinction and say you want people on Zoom to feel like they're in a tribe, that they're in this together.
Share something personal or create something together. You need that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have an upper limit on timing on Zoom? Do you think, okay, no Zoom meeting should be longer than X amount of hours or minutes? Do you have a certain thing? No, you're happy to?
No, definitely not. I mean, okay, study says we have an attention span of about 16, 17 minutes, but it's only for things you don't like. We can watch a movie for 3 hours without difficulties whatsoever and still want more. But what happens with movies, there's a lot of changes, dynamic changes in screens. If you watch a movie from 50 years ago, one shot could take 30 seconds, a minute, for example. And now you'll have a screen change in 3 seconds or less? So there's a lot more dynamics. But you've all been there when you heard a speaker to which you can listen all day. There are people who can do that. So it's all about grabbing attention. What I do believe is you don't want just a person who will talk for 60 minutes. That's too long. So you need to have the interaction. Instead of telling something, experience it. For example, we had something about conscious and subconscious information. And you can tell that your subconscious can handle 200,000 times more information than your consciousness. Okay, then I've told it. But what I did is I let people take a piece of paper and put a dot on it, 1 millimeter thick. And now please do a circle around it, how big you think your subconscious is. So people will make a small circle about it or a big circle. Okay, and then you go to the small circle. Why do you think it's a small circle? Who has the biggest circle? Okay, you're closest, but you're still wrong. Actually, it should be a circle about 200 meters in diameter. And if you do that, you'll get your response is a lot different. Just look at it differently. You get to experience it.
Oh, that is awesome. Thank you. That's like a really great video snippet for LinkedIn. It's such a cool way of expressing it because I think it's all about scale, right? And how do you represent that? I love when people say, if you did this, it would be like walking between here and the moon like 5 times or whatever. Like it's just bringing in scale. But what you've done is actually creating that moment of realization. It becomes real. It's real through that activity.
But this is a more important step. If you say it's 5 times to the moon, they will just assume it is. But if you ask them, how far do you think it is? They need to think about it. And they might think from here to, I don't know, for between Europe and Australia.
Down the road. Yeah.
Exactly. But if you say it's 5 times to the moon, it will hit you even more because it's a lot more than you thought. So there's an important step in between where people think about it for themselves. It will make even more of an impression because of the difference. It's all about contrast.
It's all about contrast. Thank you for using my favorite word and for bringing in that. Like that's a really powerful thing. Yeah, contrast. I love it. So, Kjell, can you please share with listeners if they want to sort of jump on to one of your webinars or get some moderation training? You've shared so many amazing practical. We really got into detail. All of my podcast guests are really different. Sometimes we float between like philosophy, and I think with you, we've gone all the way through, even talking about timing and asking questions before you give scale. Where can we send people if they'd love to connect with you and find out more about what you do?
Yeah, the best way is probably LinkedIn, though I must admit it's mostly in Dutch. It's just Kjell Lutz, so I'll probably spell it in the show notes or something. That's much easier. And most of my international work is through Masters in Moderation. As far as I know, the only international agency that does only moderators, and the international trainings are through them as well.
Fantastic. It's such a unique skill. I mean, I've been asked to do panels before, but I didn't really think of it to the level that you're talking about, that mastery level. So I've certainly learned a lot. I love running panels. I think it's really fun. I'm sure you're motivated the same way. It's just great to have that energy and get the great conversations happening. Kjell, you should really start your own podcast.
Well, the funny thing is how I came to buy your podcast is because I was looking for a moderation podcast, but couldn't find any. But I think that for facilitating, there are so many close links that I've learned a lot from your podcast and a couple of different ones as well, because there's a lot of overlap in skills. At least I think so.
Well, that's how I started this podcast. I was looking for facilitation podcasts and all I could find was stuff about public speaking. And then so I started it. So look, there's definitely a moderation podcast in you, I think. Kjell, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. It's been great connecting with you today.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Hey, thanks so much for sticking around. You've reached the end of another episode of the First Time Facilitator podcast. Connect with the show at firsttimefacilitator.com or follow me on Instagram at Leanne Hughes to find out what I'm up to during the week. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with someone who will also appreciate the insight, and make it easier for yourself and subscribe to the show in your podcast player of choice. Thank you so much for listening, and chat to you next week.